They laughed when he adopted a woman with no womb. They didn't laugh long. The dust of Redemption Creek tasted of shame. It clung to the back of Ilara's throat, a gritty film as coarse as the burlap of her dress. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the town square, on the raw timber of the auction block where she stood. It wasn't a slave auction, not in the way the broadsheets wrote about the South, but it was a close cousin, a debt auction. Her late husband, a man whose love had been a flimsy thing of whispered promises and foolish gambles, had left behind a mountain of debt. The town's solution was biblical in its cruelty. She, his last remaining asset, was to be indentured. Her labor sold to the highest bidder to settle the ledger with Miller's Mercantile. Her hands were bound loosely in front of her, the rope a courtesy. No one expected her to run. Where would she go? The vast, unforgiving expanse of the frontier stretched in every direction, a wilderness that would swallow a lone woman whole. Behind her, the mercantile door was a dark maw, Mr. Miller standing on the porch, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, a ledger held in his hand like a holy book. Beside him, Reverend Blackwood nodded, his face a mask of pious sorrow that did little to hide the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He'd preached against her just last Sunday, spoken of the curse of barrenness, how a woman's worth was measured in the fruit of her womb. And Ilara, after 5 years of marriage, was fruitless, a dry and useless vine, a walking testament to God's displeasure. The townsfolk gathered, a murmuring crescent of judgment. The women whispered behind their hands, their eyes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The men stood with their arms crossed, assessing her not as a person, but as a pair of hands, a body to cook and clean. She was 24, but grief and hunger had carved years into her face. Her hair, once the color of spun corn silk, was a dull, tangled mess. Her dress hung from her frame, a ghost of the woman she'd been. "Let us begin," the Reverend announced, his voice booming with false solemnity. "A tragic day, a necessary one. The good Lord teaches us to be responsible for our debts." He gestured to Ilara. "This woman, Ilara, widow of the late Jedediah Croft, is offered for a term of 5 years indenture, to work off the debt of $67.42 owed to our good Mr. Miller." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. $67 for 5 years of a woman's life. It was a bargain. "Who will start the bidding?" Miller called out, his voice greasy with commerce. "A strong back she is. Can mend and cook, can keep a house." Silence. Then, a man from the edge of the crowd, a grimy farmer named Abernathy, spat a wad of tobacco near her feet. "What good's a woman who can't give a man sons? She's cursed, I tell you, barren." The word hit her harder than a slap. Barren. It was the brand they'd seared onto her soul. It was the reason for Jedediah's drinking, for his straying, for the hollowness that had consumed their small cabin long before death had claimed him. Reverend Blackwood raised a placating hand. "Brother Abernathy, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Her hands are able-bodied for labor, if not for child-rearing." The laughter was louder this time, sharp and cruel. It flayed her skin, stripping away the last vestiges of her dignity. Ilara stared at the dust, at the scuffed toes of her boots, fighting the tremor in her knees. She would not fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. She focused on the feeling of the sun on her scalp, the rough chafe of the rope, anything to anchor her to the moment, to keep the blackness from swallowing her whole. $10 for the 5-year term, a voice finally called. It was the blacksmith, a man with a cruel mouth and wandering hands. Ilara's stomach clenched. 15, shouted another, the owner of the saloon, whose wife had died the winter past. The thought of his stale whiskey breath on her neck made her want to vomit. The bidding crawled upwards, a slow, humiliating dissection of her worth. $20. 25. Each offer was a fresh degradation, a new vision of a grim future. She was a mule being sold, a piece of property changing hands. The sun beat down, blurring the edges of her vision. The faces in the crowd began to swim, their jeers and whispers melting into a dull roar. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate, silent prayer forming in the ruins of her heart. God, if you are there. Anyone, and then silence. Not a gradual quiet, but a sudden sharp cessation of sound, as if the entire world had drawn a collective breath. Alara opened her eyes. A figure had emerged from the shimmering heat haze at the edge of the square. A man on a tall, dark horse. So still they might have been carved from the rock of the surrounding mesas. He was a silhouette against the blinding sun, a shadow in the dust. He dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He was tall, broader than most, dressed in dusty, worn leather. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. The crowd parted for him, a silent ripple of unease and respect. He walked past the bidders, his spurs a soft, rhythmic chime that was the only sound in the suffocating silence. He stopped directly in front of the auction block, his boots inches from her own. He did not look at Miller or the Reverend. He looked at her. For the first time, someone looked at her, not through her, not at her potential for labor or the curse of her womb. He looked into her eyes, and what she saw there stole the air from her lungs. It was a desolation that mirrored her own. A quiet, profound brokenness. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind and something deeper. A sorrow that had settled into the lines around his eyes. A jagged scar ran from his temple down his cheek, disappearing into a rough, untrimmed beard. $70, the man said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a bid. It was a final statement. Miller's jaw dropped. The Reverend blinked, momentarily speechless. $70 was more than the debt. It was an absurd amount. For a 5-year indenture? Miller stammered, recovering himself. The stranger's gaze did not waver from Alara's. Not for indenture, he said, the words clear and carrying in the unnatural quiet. I'm not buying her time. I'm paying the debt. She will be a free woman. A gasp went through the crowd. This was not part of the spectacle. Freedom had no place on this block. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, his piety swelling to fill the void. Sir, that is unorthodox. The arrangement is for labor to be rendered. The debt is $67.42. The man interrupted, his voice cutting through the preacher's platitudes. I am offering 70. The remainder is for her trouble. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and began to count out coins. Their clink against his palm unnervingly loud. She walks away from here with me, free, or no deal is made. Miller, eyes wide at the sight of the silver dollars, looked at the Reverend, who was now sputtering about propriety and the town council. But the money was already on the edge of the block, gleaming in the sun. Commerce, it seemed, outweighed piety. Sold, Miller said, snatching the coins before the stranger could change his mind. The man, Silas, as she would come to know him, stepped onto the block. He didn't offer a hand. He turned his back to her, and with a small, sharp knife from his belt, sawed through the rope binding her wrists. The fibers fell away. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked back toward his horse, expecting her to follow. And she did. She stumbled down from the block, her legs unsteady, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror, and a tiny flickering spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The whispers followed her. That's Silas Kane, the rancher from Shadow Creek. Lost his wife and child in the fire 2 years back. He's half mad with grief. What's he want with a barren woman? He swung himself into the saddle and then looked down at her, his scarred face impassive. He extended a hand. It was calloused and hard, But the gesture was not unkind. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him with an easy strength that left her breathless. As the horse turned, she looked back at the crowd. Their faces were a blur of shock and derision. Abernathy was laughing, a loud, braying sound. "Cain's gone and adopted himself a woman with no womb," he howled. "A fool. And his money." The laughter followed them as they rode out of Redemption Creek, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the land. Elura held tight to the stranger, her face pressed against the rough leather of his coat, the dust of the road mixing with the salt of her tears. She was free, but she was riding into an unknown wilderness with a man whose soul was as scarred as his face, a man who had bought her freedom for reasons she could not begin to fathom. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, and she did not know if she was riding toward salvation or just a different kind of damnation. The ride to Shadow Creek was a long, silent journey through a landscape that grew increasingly wild and desolate. The sparse grasslands gave way to jagged hills and canyons carved by wind and time. Silas Cain did not speak a single word. He rode with an unyielding straightness in his back, a man at one with the rhythm of his horse and the emptiness of the country around them. Elura, perched precariously behind him, felt every jolt, every shift of his body. The intimacy of their proximity was a strange torture. She could smell the scent of horse and leather and dust on him, a clean, masculine scent that was utterly alien. She tried to keep a small distance, but the sway of the horse often threw her against his solid back, and each time she flinched, her body still coiled with the memory of public shame. Her mind raced. Who was this man? Why had he done this? The whispers in town echoed in her head. Lost his wife and child. Half mad with grief. Was he a saint or a madman? Had he saved her from the frying pan only to cast her into the fire? They arrived at his ranch as twilight bled the color from the sky. It was less a ranch and more a wound upon the land. A small, sturdy cabin stood against a backdrop of dark, brooding mesas, but next to it were the charred ruins of a larger structure. A blackened stone chimney rose from the rubble like a tombstone. The skeleton of a barn sagged nearby, its roof open to the stars. A few hardy cattle grazed in a makeshift corral, their forms ghostly in the fading light. This was not a place of prosperity. It was a place of survival, a place haunted by fire and loss. Silas dismounted and, without looking at her, said, "This is it." He gestured vaguely at the cabin. "You'll stay there." He began to unsaddle his horse, his movements efficient and practiced. Elura slid down, her muscles screaming in protest. She stood there, awkward and uncertain, a piece of driftwood washed up on a foreign shore. The cabin was small, rough-hewn, with a single window that looked like a dark, vacant eye. It was the home of a man who did not care for comfort. "Are you hungry?" His voice startled her. He was still tending to his horse, his back too. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The hunger was a dull ache in her belly. "Yes, there's flour inside. Salt pork in the crate. The well is out back." He finished with the horse, slapping its flank and sending it toward the corral. Then he turned to her, and in the deep twilight, his scarred face was all angles and shadows. "The house. The one that burned. That was ours. My wife, Sarah. My boy, Daniel." He said the names simply, without inflection, as if listing inventory. But the air around the words was heavy with their absence. This cabin was for storage. "I moved in after." He walked past her toward the charred ruins, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped by the stone chimney and stood there, a solitary figure communing with ghosts. He did not invite her to join him. He did not offer any further explanation. He had given her a roof and the promise of food. The rest was up to her. Elura pushed open the cabin door. It creaked on leather hinges. The inside was one room, stark and painfully neat. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a single threadbare blanket folded on top. A rough table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A small cold hearth was built into the stone wall. On a shelf, a few tin plates and cups were stacked with precision. It was a space stripped of all personality, all warmth. It was the den of a wounded animal. She found the flour sack and the crate of salt pork. Her hands, clumsy from disuse and fear, fumbled as she tried to start a fire in the hearth. The flint and steel felt alien in her grasp. Back in her old life, the small comforts of home had been her domain. Now, even the simple act of making a spark felt like an insurmountable challenge. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She was useless, barren. The word was a curse, a snake coiling in her gut. Finally, a tiny flame caught on the tinder. She nursed it carefully, adding small twigs until it grew into a steady, crackling fire. The warmth was a balm against the chill of the evening and the deeper chill in her bones. She mixed a crude dough for flatbread and sliced the salt pork. The sizzle and smell in the pan a small, defiant act of living. She made 2 plates. She didn't know if he would come in, if he expected her to serve him. She was no longer an indentured servant, but she was a resident in his house, a recipient of his charity. The dynamics of their relationship were a terrifying mystery. She waited, the food growing cold on the table. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Hours seemed to pass. The moon rose, casting a pale, spectral light over the ravaged landscape. She finally heard his footsteps outside. The door opened, and he filled the frame, bringing the cold night air in with him. He looked from her to the table, at the 2 plates of food. He said nothing. He walked to the water bucket, dipped a ladle, and drank deeply. Then he turned to his cot. The food. She began, her voice barely a whisper. "Not hungry," he grunted, and lay down on the cot, turning his back to her. He did not remove his boots. Elara stood by the table, the plate in her hand. The rejection was a physical blow. She was a guest, a stranger, a burden. She slowly ate her own meal, the food tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked at the man. On the cot, a wall of silence and grief. She had been saved from one prison only to enter another, a cage built of a man's sorrow and her own profound loneliness. There was no spare blanket, no other bed. She cleaned the dishes and then, with nowhere else to go, curled up on the hard floor in front of the hearth, pulling her burlap dress around her for warmth. She was a free woman, yet she had never felt more captive. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind howling through the ruins outside, a lullaby of loss. The days that followed fell into a harsh, silent rhythm. Silas rose before the sun, his movements quiet, and was gone before she was fully awake. He worked from dawn until dusk, mending the corral, tending his small herd, disappearing for hours into the canyons. He was a man possessed by work, as if he could physically exhaust the ghosts that haunted him. He rarely spoke to her. His communication consisted of grunts, nods, or a few clipped words of instruction. "The well pump is sticking. There's an axe by the woodpile. Watch for snakes." Elara, in turn, threw herself into the work of the cabin. She scrubbed the floor until the wood was pale, chased out the mice and the spiders, and patched the chinks in the walls with mud and straw. She learned the quirks of the old stove, the way the wind whistled down the chimney, the path the sun took across the floor. She established a small routine, fetching water, baking bread, mending Silas's worn shirts with thread she painstakingly unraveled from a discarded flour sack. These small domestic acts were all that kept her from screaming. They were a way to impose order on the chaos of her life, to prove, if only to herself, that she was not useless. Their evenings were excruciating. They would sit at the small table, eating in silence, the space between them a chasm. She would offer him food, and he would eat it without comment, his eyes fixed on his plate. The silence was not peaceful. It was loud, filled with the unspoken things. His grief, her shame, their shared isolation. She learned to read the landscape of his sorrow in the clench of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way he sometimes stared into the fire, his eyes seeing flames that were no longer there. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the mountains. A violent, sudden squall that turned the sky black. Rain lashed against the cabin, and wind howled like a banshee. Silas had been out on the range, and he returned soaked to the bone, his face grim. He came inside, dripping water onto the floor she had just cleaned. He stood by the fire, shivering, his teeth chattering. For the first time, she saw a crack in his armor of stoicism. She saw not the intimidating stranger, but a cold, tired man. On impulse, she took the threadbare blanket from his cot and walked over to him. He watched her approach, his eyes wary. She hesitated, then draped the blanket over his broad shoulders. His body went rigid at her touch. He stared at her, his eyes searching hers for what? Pity. She didn't know. She held his gaze, her heart pounding. She did not look away. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. A recognition of shared pain. He didn't thank her. But he didn't push her away, either. He simply pulled the blanket tighter around himself and stood closer to the fire. It was the first bridge, however fragile, built across the chasm of their silence. Survival was a brutal teacher. One morning, she found one of the hens from the small coop he kept had been taken by a coyote. The remaining birds were panicked. Silas came back to find her trying to reinforce the flimsy door of the coop with rocks. He watched her for a moment, her hands raw, her face smudged with dirt. "That won't hold," he said. He went to the dilapidated barn and returned with old planks and a hammer. Side by side, they worked. He showed her how to hold the nail, how to swing the hammer with her whole arm, not just her wrist. Her first few attempts were clumsy, the nails bending under her inexpert blows. He didn't laugh. He simply took her hand, his own calloused and warm, and guided it, showing her the proper angle. His touch was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first time they had worked together, their bodies moving in a shared purpose. They didn't talk, but the rhythmic sound of the hammer became a form of communication. When they were finished, the co-op was secure. They stood back, surveying their work, a small island of order in the surrounding decay. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He just nodded, but he met her eyes for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Trust was not a decision. It was a slow, glacial accretion of small moments. It was him leaving a bucket of fresh milk from one of his cows on the cabin step in the morning. It was her leaving a hot meal on the table for him, even when he came in late, and finding the plate clean the next day. It was the time he found her weeping silently by the well, overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing loneliness of it all. He didn't say a word. He just took the heavy bucket from her hands and carried it back to the cabin for her. It was a clumsy attempt at tenderness, but it was more than anyone had offered her in years. One evening, he brought back a small withered apple from town, the first fruit she had seen since she arrived. He placed it on the table between them, a peace offering. She cut it in half, the knife making a crisp sound in the quiet room. She pushed one half toward him. He looked at it, then at her, and for the first time, the faintest hint of something other than sorrow flickered in his eyes. He took the apple slice and ate it. They ate their apple together, the shared sweetness. A startling contrast to the bitterness of their lives. They were two broken souls, living in the ruins of a third, and for a fleeting moment, the silence between them felt less like an absence and more like a shared space. It was not love. It was not even friendship. It was the simple, profound recognition of another's humanity in the desolate wilderness of their pain. And for now it was enough. The trip to town was a necessity they had postponed for as long as possible. The flour was gone, the salt pork was dwindling, and Silas needed to trade some hides for nails and other supplies. The thought of returning to Redemption Creek filled Ilara with a cold dread. She remembered the faces in the crowd, the laughter, the jeers, the brand of Baron and bought. "You don't have to come," Silas said, his voice a low rumble as he hitched the wagon. It was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging her feelings. "There's nothing for me to do here," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. To stay behind would be to hide, to accept their judgment. To go was to defy it. She tied a bonnet over her hair, her hands trembling slightly, and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. The journey was as silent as their first ride, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense quiet of strangers. It was the practiced quiet of two people who had learned to exist in the same small space. As they neared the town, Ilara could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The buildings of Redemption Creek rose from the plains, looking just as harsh and judgmental as she remembered. As they rolled down the main street, heads turned. Whispers started like a contagion, spreading from porch to porch. She saw Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stop her sweeping and stare, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. She saw Abernathy, the farmer who had jeered at her, standing with a group of men outside the saloon. He pointed at them, a smirk on his face. "Well, looky here," he called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's the mad rancher and his barren bride." A few of his companions snickered. Ilara flinched, her face burning with humiliation. She stared straight ahead, focusing on the horse's ears, praying for the ground to swallow her. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Miller's Mercantile. He didn't look at Abernathy. He didn't acknowledge the stares. He simply set the brake and turned to Ilara. "Wait here," he said, his voice calm and even. But she saw the muscle twitch in his jaw, the tightening of his hands on the reins. He swung down from the wagon and walked into the store, his back a rigid wall of defiance. Ilara sat alone, exposed, the target of every curious and malicious eye in town. The whispers grew bolder. "Look at her, sitting up there like she's a proper lady. He paid $70 for that. A fool and his money, just like Abernathy said." Each word was a small stone thrown at her. She felt them striking her, bruising her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but she forced herself to sit upright, to keep her chin high. She would not let them see her break. Inside the store, Silas conducted his business with a cold efficiency. He laid his hides on the counter. Miller, his eyes darting nervously toward the street, weighed them. "Heard you've been keeping busy out at Shadow Creek," Miller said, attempting a conversational tone. "I have," Silas replied, his voice flat. "The woman she's working out, is she?" Miller couldn't help himself. The gossip was too tantalizing. Silas stopped what he was doing and leveled a gaze at Miller so cold it could have frozen fire. "The woman's name is Ilara," he said, his voice dangerously low. "She is not working out. She lives in my home as my family." The word felt strange and new on his tongue, but he said it with an unshakable finality. "Her business is my business, and my business is my own." Miller paled, busying himself with the ledger. "Of course, Silas. No offense meant." When Silas emerged from the store, his arms laden with sacks of flour and sugar, Abernathy and his cronies were still loitering by the saloon. "Hey, Kane," Abernathy shouted, emboldened by whiskey. "You getting any sons from that Baron? Ground you plowed your silver into?" The street went silent. This was more than a taunt. It was a public challenge, a direct insult to a man's pride and a woman's honor. Elura's breath caught in her throat. She saw Silas stop. He set the sacks down carefully on the wagon. He turned slowly to face Abernathy. The air crackled with tension. Everyone was watching, waiting for the explosion. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He simply walked toward Abernathy, his steps measured and deliberate. The other men fell back, sensing the shift in the air. Silas stopped. In front of the farmer, who was a head shorter but puffed up with drunken bravado. "You have something to say to me?" Silas asked, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "I said," Abernathy slurred, "that you're a fool for taking in damaged goods. A woman who can't fulfill her purpose is worthless." Silas looked at Abernathy, his eyes devoid of emotion. Then he looked around at the watching faces, at Reverend Blackwood, who had just stepped out of the church, drawn by the commotion. "Her purpose?" Silas said, his voice still quiet but carrying with a chilling clarity. "You think a woman's purpose is to be a vessel? A broodmare for your fields? You measure her worth in heartbeats, but only the ones that ain't her own?" He took a step closer, and Abernathy, despite his bravado, flinched. "Let me tell you her worth. She can take a house that's been hollowed out by death and make it a home. She can face down hunger and grief and a town full of whispering cowards and still stand tall. She can take a man who was nothing but a ghost walking in the ruins of his own life and make him feel human again." He paused, and the silence was deafening. He had said more than he had spoken in the past 2 years combined. The words were raw, torn from a place of deep pain and dawning revelation. He was not just offending her. He was discovering the truth of his own feelings as he spoke. "That woman," he said, turning his head slightly to gesture toward the wagon where Elara sat, tears streaming silently down her face, "has more strength and more worth in her little finger than you have in your entire bitter soul. She is not barren. Your hearts are barren. Your town is barren." He turned his back on Abernathy and walked back to the wagon, leaving the farmer sputtering and speechless. He loaded the rest of the supplies without another word. As he climbed back onto the seat, he didn't look at Elara, but he was so close. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the thrum of his anger and conviction. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. As they rode out of town, they passed a small homestead on the outskirts. A woman, Mary, a quiet widow who had always been kind to Elara in her previous life, was in her yard. She had heard the commotion. As the wagon passed, she looked at Elara, and she smiled, a small, genuine smile of solidarity. And she nodded. It was a tiny gesture, but in the hostile landscape of Redemption Creek, it was a seed of hope. The whispers hadn't stopped, but for the first time, they were joined by something else, a grudging respect. A man had stood in the center of town and declared a barren woman's worth in terms that had nothing to do with her womb. He had held a mirror up to their cruelty, and some of them, just some, did not like the reflection they saw. The tide had not turned, but a single powerful wave had just broken against the shore. The journey back to Shadow Creek was charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. The air in the wagon was thick with unspoken words, with the raw, exposed nerves of Silas's declaration. Elara stole glances at him, at his stoic profile against the setting sun. She can take a man who is nothing but a ghost and make him feel human again. The words echoed in her mind, a stunning, unbelievable revelation. Had she done that? Could she have had such an effect on this broken, silent man? When they reached the ranch, the familiar routine felt different. The silence that fell between them as they unloaded the supplies was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of his voice, his defense of her. As she put away the flour and sugar in the cabin that was now undeniably their home, she felt a shift inside her. The shame that had been her constant companion for so long had begun to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of worth. He had given her that. In front of everyone, he had handed her back her dignity. That night, for the first time, he did not immediately retreat to his cot. He sat at the table while she prepared the meal, watching her move about the small space. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, kindled a warmth in his dark eyes. "What you said." "In town," she began, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Thank you." He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. "I only spoke the truth," he said gruffly. She placed a plate of hot stew in front of him. He looked up, and their eyes met across the table. In that long, silent gaze, the last of the walls between them seemed to crumble into dust. They were no longer just two survivors sharing a roof. They were partners. They were family. The word he had used in the store hung in the air, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. The changing of the seasons mirrored the changing of their lives. Autumn painted the canyons in fiery hues of red and gold. The harshness of the land softened, became beautiful. Their life together found a new rhythm, one of comfort and easy companionship. The silences were now peaceful, filled with an understanding that required no words. Laughter, a sound Ilara thought she had forgotten, began to find its way into the small cabin. It started with small things, a clumsy calf tripping over its own feet, Ilara accidentally dusting her face with flour, Silas's rare, dry wit surfacing in a wry comment. He began to share pieces of his past with her, small, painful fragments, offered up like precious stones. He told her about Sarah, his wife, her love for wildflowers, the way she used to sing while she baked. He spoke of Daniel, their son, a boy with his mother's laugh and a wild fascination with lizards and birds. He spoke of the fire, not the details of the horror, but the suffocating blanket of grief that had followed, the feeling of being utterly, completely alone. As he spoke, Ilara listened, her heart aching for his loss, but also filling with a quiet strength. He was trusting her with his ghosts, and in doing so, he was letting them go. She, in turn, told him of her own quiet sorrows, the years of desperate prayers for a child, the shame and self-loathing, the slow death of her spirit long before her husband had died. In the safe harbor of the cabin, these confessions were not sources of shame, but shared burdens that lightened with the telling. They were two people defined by what they had lost, who were now together, finding what they could build. One crisp autumn evening, he came in from the barn, holding something carefully in his hands. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. He had made it. The detail was exquisite, each feather etched with a patient, loving hand. "For Daniel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I used to make them for him. I haven't since the fire." He held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. It was an offering of his most profound pain and his most enduring love. "It's beautiful, Silas," she whispered. He looked at the empty space on the mantelpiece above the hearth. I think it's time this place had something beautiful in it again." He took the bird from her and set it on the mantel. It was a small object, but it transformed the room. It filled the space with memory and love, a testament not just to what was lost, but to what was being reclaimed. That night, after they had cleaned up from dinner, Ilara went to her usual spot on the floor by the hearth. "Ilara," Silas said, his voice stopping her. She looked up. He was standing by the table, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "The floor is cold," he said simply. He walked over to his cot, took the single blanket, and then crossed to the corner where a pile of spare grain sacks lay. He arranged them into a thick pallet, a makeshift bed. He laid the blanket over it. "This will be warmer." It was not an invitation to his bed. It was something more profound. It was an acknowledgement of her as an equal, as someone deserving of comfort. It was an act of quiet, profound care. She moved to the pallet, the warmth a startling comfort. She lay down, and he returned to his cot. For a long while, they lay in the dark, the only sound the breathing of two people who had finally found a safe place to rest. "Silas," she whispered into the darkness. I'm glad you paid the debt." She heard him shift on the cot. A long silence followed. Then his voice, rough with emotion, came out of the dark. "It's the best $70 I ever spent." Winter arrived, blanketing the world in a pristine, unforgiving white. The isolation of the ranch became absolute. The road to Redemption Creek was impassable, and they were thrown entirely upon their own resources, their own company. The cabin became their entire world, a small bubble of warmth and light against the vast frozen wilderness. This enforced proximity, which would have been a torment months before, was now a quiet blessing. They worked together to survive the harshness of the season. They chopped wood, their breath pluming in the frigid air, the rhythmic thud of the axe a heartbeat. Against the silence of the snow, they repaired the collapsing roof of the old barn, Silas on the ladder, Ilara below, handing him tools, their movements a practice dance. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, mending clothes, oiling leather, the simple shared tasks a foundation of their life. One day, a blizzard descended upon them without warning, a furious howling vortex of wind and snow that erased the world outside their window. The temperature plummeted. They huddled by the fire, feeding at logs, the cabin groaning under the assault of the wind. A terrible cracking sound echoed from the direction of the corral. "The cattle," Silas said, his face grim. He pulled on his heaviest coat. "You can't go out in that." Ilara cried, grabbing his arm. "You'll freeze to death." "They'll drift and die if I don't get them into the barn," he said, his jaw set. "I have to. Then I'm coming with you." It was not a question. She would not let him face the storm alone. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and nodded. They tied ropes around their waists, tethering themselves to the cabin and to each other. They stepped out into the white chaos. The wind was a physical force, stealing their breath, stinging their faces with ice. Visibility was near zero. They fought their way toward the barn, guided by memory and the rope. The cattle were huddled together, lowing in terror, their backs already thick with snow. What followed was a desperate, brutal battle against the elements. They pushed and pulled the terrified animals toward the relative safety of the barn, their bodies aching with cold and exertion. At one point, Ilara slipped on a patch of ice, her feet going out from under her. The wind caught her, threatening to tear her away, but the rope held. Silas, an anchor in the storm, pulled her back, his strength a raw primal force against the fury of nature. He hauled her to her feet, his hands gripping her arms, his face inches from hers. In the screaming chaos of the blizzard, their eyes met. Fear, desperation, and a fierce protective tenderness swirled between them. There, in the heart of the storm, they were not a man and a woman. They were a single unit, fighting for their shared life. They got the last of the cattle inside and barred the door just as the old structure seemed ready to tear itself apart. They collapsed against the hay, gasping for breath, their bodies numb with cold, but alive. They had won, together. Silas looked at her, her face red with cold, her hair caked with snow, and he smiled. A true, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his scarred face. "We did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. She smiled back, a tired, triumphant grin. "We did it." They huddled together in the hay for warmth, waiting for the worst of the storm to pass. The fury outside was matched by a quiet storm inside Ilara's heart. She had faced public humiliation, starvation, loneliness. But in that moment, fighting the blizzard alongside Silas, she had never felt stronger, never felt more alive. This man, this broken silent man, had not just saved her body from indenture. He had saved her soul from despair. He had shown her a strength she never knew she possessed. And she, in turn, had watched him slowly, painstakingly, come back to life. She had seen the ghost in his eyes replaced by the man he was meant to be. The storm broke at dawn. The world was transformed. Buried under a deep, silent blanket of snow, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The beauty was breathtaking, a fresh start. As they walked back to the cabin, the world felt new. That spring, as the snow melted and the first green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth, something else began to blossom in the small cabin at Shadow Creek. The companionship that had sustained them through the winter deepened into something tender and profound. The wall of grief and shame had been fully dismantled, plank by plank, by shared work, shared laughter, and shared survival. What remained was a clear, open space between them, filled with a quiet, powerful affection. It happened one evening as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley. Ilara was tending to a small patch of earth near the cabin, where she had planted a few vegetable seeds salvaged from the supplies. She was trying to coax life from the hard soil, her hands covered in dirt. Silas came and stood beside her, watching. "Sarah used to love to garden," he said softly, the memory no longer just a source of pain, but a gentle echo. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hand resting near her smaller one on the ground. She'd say that putting a seed in the ground was an act of faith. Ilara looked at him, at the way the fading light caught the silver in his beard. She saw the man, not the ghost. The protector, not the stranger. The partner, not the savior. "It is," she said, her voice catching. "It's a belief in tomorrow." He turned his hand over and gently, tentatively, laced his fingers through hers. His touch was warm, solid, real. It was not a gesture of passion, but of belonging. A quiet claiming, a question and an answer all in one. She squeezed his hand, and in that simple act, a promise was made. A new garden was being planted, not in the soil, but in the fertile ground of their healed hearts. Their love was not a sudden fire, but the slow, steady warmth of a hearth that had been carefully tended through a long winter. It was in the way he brought her a wildflower he'd found blooming in a hidden canyon. It was in the way she saved him the last piece of pie, knowing it was his favorite. It was in the comfortable silences, the shared glances, the easy rhythm of their life together. The cabin, once a symbol of loneliness, was now filled with a quiet joy. The ghosts had not vanished, but they no longer haunted the rooms. They were now gentle memories, honored ancestors of the new life that had grown in their place. When the road to town was finally clear, they went back. Not with dread, but with a quiet confidence. As they rode down the main street, the whispers were still there, but they were different. The scorn had been replaced by a grudging awe. The story of how Silas Kane had defended the barren woman had become a local legend. The tale of their survival through the blizzard, which had devastated other, less prepared ranches, had only added to it. They were no longer seen as a madman. And his unfortunate purchase, they were seen as survivors, as a force to be reckoned with. Mary, the widow, waved to them openly from her porch. The blacksmith, who had once bid on Ilara, averted his eyes, a flicker of shame on his face. Even Reverend Blackwood, standing outside his church, gave them a stiff, formal nod of acknowledgement. The town's judgment had not been defeated in a single battle, but eroded over time by the simple, undeniable truth of their life together. Their dignity was its own defense. One afternoon, a rider approached the ranch. It was the sheriff from Redemption Creek. Ilara's heart seized with a familiar fear. Trouble always came on horseback. Silas met him in the yard, his stance relaxed. "But wary, Silas." "Ma'am," the sheriff said, tipping his hat to Ilara. "Got some news. It's about Abernathy." Silas waited, his face impassive. The bank in the next county over finally foreclosed on him, the sheriff explained. His land wasn't his own, all that bluster. It was the talk of a desperate man. They're auctioning off his property next week to settle his debts. The sheriff paused, a look of grim irony on his face. His wife and kids. They've got nowhere to go. The church is taking up a collection, but... He trailed off, the implication clear. Silas and Alara exchanged a look. They knew that story. The humiliation of a debt auction. The terror of being cast out with nothing. Reverend Blackwood sent me, the sheriff admitted, looking uncomfortable. He said maybe you'd have some advice on how a community ought to treat folks in that position. The request was a stunning admission. A plea for guidance from the very people the town had once ostracized. It was a surrender. Silas looked past the sheriff at the charred ruins of his first home, then at the sturdy cabin that he and Alara had made their own. He looked at Alara, at the strength in her eyes, the quiet confidence in her posture. He had fought for her honor in the middle of town. She had fought for his life in the middle of a blizzard. They had built a family not on blood, but on choice. They had found abundance not in a womb, but in the steadfast loyalty of their own hearts. Tell the Reverend, Silas said, his voice calm and clear, that a person's worth isn't measured by what they can produce or what they owe. It's measured by their capacity for kindness. Tell him to cancel the auction. A family isn't a debt to be settled. It's a garden to be tended. The sheriff stared, dumbfounded by the simple, profound wisdom of it. He nodded slowly. I'll tell him. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the scent of change in the air. That evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of rose, Silas took Alara's hand and led her to the base of the tall stone chimney, the last remnant of his old life. It stood like a monument to all they had endured and overcome. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the promise of summer. I stood here the day I brought you home, he said, his voice thick. I was a dead man. This chimney was my tombstone. I didn't bring you here to save you, Alara, I think. I think I brought you here to save me. Tears welled in her eyes. We saved each other, she whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It had been his mother's. He had ridden into a neighboring town the week before, without telling her why, and traded the last of his valuable hides for it. This ain't a fancy church, he said, his voice breaking. There's no preacher, no crowd of witnesses. There's just this land and the sky, and the ghosts of those we loved. He looked into her eyes, his own shining with a love so fierce and true, it took her breath away. Alara, they said you were barren, but my life was the barren thing. You walked into it, and you planted a garden. You made it bloom. Will you be my wife? Will you let me be your husband? Will you be my family by choice until the end of our days? She was weeping freely now, tears of a joy so profound it felt like a holy fire, burning away the last ashes of her old sorrow. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Silas, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He was not a savior, and she was not a victim. They were two broken halves who had found their wholeness in each other. They stood before that stone chimney, a symbol of ruin and rebirth, and they were married. The community that witnessed their union was the silent, watchful land, the vast, open sky, and the quiet dignity of their own healed hearts. Their home was repaired, their scars had become their strength, and the laughter that now filled their small cabin was the most beautiful harvest of all. They had been broken. Now they were whole. And in the vast, quiet wilderness of the West, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, they had discovered what love, family, and redemption truly feel like. It felt like coming home,